I walked into my own bank to withdraw $6,000 and the teller froze. Her hands hovered over the keyboard, her face draining of color as she stared at the screen. The branch manager rushed out, asked me to step into his private office and turned his monitor toward me. "Mr. Wallace," he said, his voice shaking. "Someone withdrew everything this morning using your signature." Then he pressed play on the security footage. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. It was supposed to be a completely ordinary Tuesday morning, the kind of crisp, quiet autumn day that retirees like me are supposed to spend drinking black coffee and reading the local newspaper. I am Gordon Wallace. I am 71 years old, and until that Tuesday, I believed I had successfully raised a son who understood the value of hard work. I drove my 10-year-old sedan to the local bank branch just after 10 o'clock. I needed to withdraw $6,000 to pay a contractor for repairing the flashing on my roof. It was a simple, mundane task. I walked up to the teller counter and handed my withdrawal slip to a young woman named Bethany. She had cashed my checks for years, always greeting me with a warm smile. But today, the smile vanished the second she typed my account number into her system. I watched her eyes widen. She tapped the keys again faster this time, as if hoping the machine had made a mechanical error. She swallowed hard, looked at me with an expression of pure terror, and whispered that she needed to get the branch manager. The air in the bank suddenly felt heavy. I stood there leaning slightly on the counter, feeling the first prickle of unease. A minute later, Mr. Dalton, the branch manager I had known for over a decade, emerged from the back offices. He did not have his usual cheerful demeanor. His face was pale, his shoulders tight. He asked me to step into his office and close the heavy glass door behind us, sealing off the ambient noise of the bank lobby. "Mr. Wallace, please sit down," he said, gesturing to the leather chair opposite his desk. I remained standing. I asked him what the problem was. He took a deep breath, turned his computer monitor so I could see the screen, and delivered the words that effectively ended my family as I knew it. He told me that my checking account and my primary savings account, which held exactly $150,000, had been drained to zero. The entire balance had been wired to an external account just 2 hours prior. My heart did not skip a beat. I did not gasp or clutch my chest. Instead, a chilling, profound silence settled over my mind. Mr. Dalton, visibly sweating frantically, clicked his mouse and brought up the security camera footage from earlier that morning. He pressed play. I watched the silent, grainy video on the screen. 2 people walked up to the very same counter I had just stood at. One was a tall man in a tailored suit. The other was a woman with perfectly styled blonde hair holding a thick manila folder. It was Connor, my only son, and beside him was his wife, Monica. I watched through the screen as my own flesh and blood slid a stack of papers across the counter to the teller. Dalton's voice broke the silence in the office. He explained that Connor and Monica had presented a fully notarized power of attorney along with a certified medical document from a physician. The doctor's note claimed that I was suffering from severe, rapidly advancing dementia and was entirely mentally unfit to manage my own financial affairs. They had legally hijacked my identity, my autonomy, and my assets. Dalton picked up his desk phone, his hand shaking. He told me we needed to call the police right now, that this was massive fraud. I reached out and gently pushed his hand down, disconnecting the line. I told him no. I spent 35 years of my life working as a senior logistics auditor for a massive multinational corporation. My entire career was dedicated to hunting down corporate thieves, exposing embezzlers, and dismantling financial conspiracies. I had sat across from panicked executives who had stolen millions, watching them sweat as I laid out the paper trails they thought they had burned. I knew intimately that in cases of fraud, panic yields absolutely nothing. Evidence yields everything. I looked at the frozen image of my son on the monitor. I had purposely kept that specific bank account limited to $150,000. I let Connor believe that was my entire life savings, my complete nest egg. I did it because I wanted him to learn independence to build his own wealth, without waiting for a handout from his father. Clearly, he had decided that stealing from an old man was easier than working for a living. I looked at Dalton with a cold, steady gaze. I told him I did not want the police involved just yet. Instead, I demanded high-resolution copies of the forged power of attorney, the fake medical certificate, the time-stamped security footage, and the exact routing numbers of the external account where my money had been sent. Dalton was stunned, but my tone left no room for argument. He scrambled to print the documents and burn the footage onto a flash drive. I took the heavy folder from his hands, thanked him for his time, and walked out of the bank. I was no longer a retired father running a mundane errand. I was an auditor who had just been handed the most important case file of my life. The drive back to my house was a masterclass in emotional compartmentalization. I gripped the steering wheel methodically, processing the betrayal. Connor did not just steal my money. By presenting a forged medical document declaring me incompetent, he had attempted to legally erase my existence. He was trying to strip away my fundamental rights as a human being. To the state, I was now a ghost, a helpless ward to be managed by a greedy son. I analyzed the angles, calculating the depth of the conspiracy. To forge a medical certificate meant they had a corrupt doctor in their pocket. To forge a power of attorney meant they had a compromised notary. This was not a crime of opportunity. This was a premeditated, calculated execution. I turned onto my quiet, tree-lined suburban street, ready to lock myself in my study and begin tracing the money. But the universe had a different plan. As my house came into view, the conflict escalated with sickening speed. A massive commercial moving truck was parked squarely in my driveway. The back ramp was lowered, resting on my front lawn. I parked my car on the street, my pulse finally beginning to thrum with a dark, heavy anger. I walked up my driveway. The front door of the home I had paid off decades ago, the home where my late wife Diane and I had raised our son, was propped wide open with a brick. I stepped through the doorway. The living room was a scene of calculated destruction. Connor and Monica were standing in the center of the room, casually ripping my life apart. Monica was violently tossing framed photographs, books, and keepsakes into cheap cardboard boxes. Connor was taping them shut, whistling a tune as if he were cleaning out an abandoned storage locker. I stood in the foyer holding the bank folder tightly against my side, watching the two people who had just stolen my life savings prepare to throw me out of my own home. I stood in the entryway of my own home, the heavy bank folder pressed tightly against my ribs, and watched the systematic erasure of my life. The living room, a space Diane and I had carefully curated over 40 years, was unrecognizable. The oriental rug was rolled up and shoved into a corner. The mahogany bookshelves, which I had built with my own two hands, were completely bare. In the center of the room stood a fortress of cheap brown cardboard boxes. The harsh ripping sound of packing tape, echoing through the room, felt like a physical blow. Connor pulled the tape dispenser across the top of a box, tore it with a quick snap of his wrist, and reached for another stack of my books. Monica was near the fireplace, casually wrapping my antique mantel clock in bubble wrap. She was humming a cheerful, upbeat tune. Neither of them looked like criminals caught in the act. They looked like people doing a routine weekend chore. I cleared my throat. It was not a loud noise, but in the hollow acoustics of the half-empty room, it sounded like a gunshot. Connor froze. He slowly turned around, the tape dispenser dangling from his fingers. Monica paused her humming and looked over her shoulder. I expected panic. I expected the sudden pale terror of two thieves caught red-handed. I expected Connor to drop his gaze in shame. Instead, what I saw was a chillingly rehearsed performance. Monica smiled. It was not her usual tight, polite smile. It was a wide, sickeningly sweet grin, the kind of smile a kindergarten teacher gives to a toddler who has just woken up from a nap. She set down the bubble wrap, wiped her hands on her designer jeans, and walked toward me with slow, exaggerated steps. She reached out and placed a gentle, patronizing hand on my forearm. "Gordon, sweetie," she said, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. "What are you doing out of bed? You know you need to be resting. It is a big day today. It is moving day. The sheer audacity of her tone sent a shockwave of cold clarity through my veins. Moving day. She said the words so brightly, so cheerfully, as if we were embarking on a fun family vacation. She patted my arm, again her eyes wide and full of fake, manufactured pity. I looked down at her hand on my sleeve. I wanted to grab her wrist and demand to know where my $150,000 went. I wanted to scream until my lungs gave out. But my auditor brain, the instinct honed over 35 years of dismantling corporate fraud, slammed the brakes on my emotions. If I screamed, I would sound unhinged. If I demanded my money, I would sound paranoid. I would give them exactly what they needed. I stepped back, letting her hand fall away from my arm. I looked at my son. Connor had set down the tape dispenser and was now walking over to join his wife. He had his hands buried deep in his pockets, his shoulders slumped in a posture of mock exhaustion. He looked at me with a heavily practiced expression of sorrow and burden. Dad, Connor said, his voice soft and soothing. We talked about this. You promised you would not go wandering off today. You worried us sick. I stared at him. We talked about what I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. Connor sighed a long theatrical sigh designed to show anyone watching just how much patience he was exercising. He exchanged a knowing, tragic glance with Monica. She shook her head sadly and murmured something about how hard it was to watch me deteriorate. Dad, you forgot again, Connor said, taking a step closer. His eyes locked onto mine, and for a fraction of a second, I saw the cold, hard greed hiding behind his mask of concern. You forgot the conversation we had on Sunday. We agreed that the house is just too much for you to maintain anymore. Your memory is slipping, Dad. You have been leaving the stove on. You have been wandering around the neighborhood. We agreed it was time to sell the house and get you into a place where you can be properly taken care of. My mind processed his lies with terrifying speed. Leaving the stove on. Wandering the neighborhood. He was building a narrative. He was establishing a verbal paper trail of my supposed incompetence. He was projecting the exact symptoms listed on the forged medical document they had handed to the bank teller that very morning. They needed to sell my house, an $800,000 asset, with no mortgage, and they needed me out of the way to do it. I do not remember any conversation about selling my home, I said. My voice was steady, but I let a slight tremble enter my hands. I needed them to believe their gaslighting was working. I needed them to think they were breaking my grip on reality. Monica stepped in, taking over the psychological assault. Oh, Gordon, it breaks my heart when you get confused like this, she cooed, tilting her head in a display of exaggerated sympathy. Dr. Vance warned us this would happen. He told us that your dementia would cause these sudden memory lapses and mood swings. He said, we just have to be patient and help you transition into the managed care facility. It is going to be so wonderful for you there, Gordon. They have activities and a lovely garden and nurses round the clock. A managed care facility. The words hung in the air, toxic and heavy. They were not just packing up my house to sell it. They were packing me up to dispose of me. They had drained my bank accounts to zero, and now they were going to lock me in a state-run warehouse for the elderly so they could liquidate my home and pocket the equity. And they were doing it right to my face, cloaking their grand larceny in the language of love and familial duty. Connor placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. It took every ounce of willpower I possessed not to strike him. I know it is scary, Dad, Connor said, his voice dropping to a sympathetic whisper. But we are doing this because we love you. We cannot let you live here alone anymore. It is not safe. The movers are coming tomorrow to take the big furniture, so Monica and I are just getting a head start on the small things. Why do you not go into your room and lie down? We have everything under control out here. I looked around the room. I looked at the boxes that contained the history of my life with Diane. I looked at my son, a man I had raised, a man I had protected, a man who was now looking at me as a physical obstacle standing between him and a payday. They were trying to rewrite my reality. They were trying to convince me that my mind was failing, that my memory was broken, and that my complete surrender was my only option. In the world of auditing, the most dangerous criminals are never the ones who act guilty. The most dangerous ones are the ones who look you right in the eye, smile, and tell you that the missing money never existed in the first place. Connor and Monica had rehearsed this scene. They had prepared for my anger. They had prepared for my confusion. They were ready to use any emotional outburst as further proof of my mental decline. So I gave them nothing. I did not argue. I did not mention the bank. I did not mention the security footage burning a hole in the folder under my arm. I simply lowered my gaze, letting my shoulders slump forward to mimic defeat. I let my breathing become shallow and erratic, playing the part of the confused, frightened old man they needed me to be. "I suppose I am feeling a bit tired," I muttered, making sure my voice sounded frail and uncertain. "I think I will go lie down for a while." Monica beamed, clapping her hands together softly. "That is a wonderful idea, Gordon. You just go rest. We will take care of everything." I turned my back on them and walked slowly down the hallway toward my bedroom. Every step was deliberate. Every shuffle of my feet was a calculated performance. As I moved away from the living room, I heard Connor let out a low, victorious chuckle. I heard the ripping sound of the packing tape resume. They thought they had won. They thought their gaslighting had successfully broken my spirit. They thought I was retreating to my room to accept my fate as a victim of a failing mind, but they were gravely mistaken. I was not retreating. I was going to my room to review the evidence. I was going to my room to assess the battlefield. They had declared war on my life, my freedom, and my legacy. They had used my love for my son as a weapon against me. But as I closed my bedroom door and locked it quietly behind me, the frail old man vanished. The auditor took over. They wanted to play a game of numbers and documents. They had no idea that they had just challenged the man who spent a lifetime tearing those exact games apart. I stood in the hallway, letting the silence stretch out between us. It was a calculated pause, a moment to assess the battlefield. My eyes drifted from Connor's fake, concerned smile to Monica. She had moved away from the mantelpiece and was now standing by the large oak bookcase near the window. I watched her reach up and pull down a stack of Diane's vintage jazz records. These were not just vinyl discs. They were the soundtrack to our marriage. Diane had spent years collecting them, scouring estate sales and flea markets for rare pressings. We used to spend our Sunday mornings listening to them, the warm, crackling sound of the trumpet filling the house while we drank our coffee. Monica didn't even look at the covers. She just dumped the entire stack into a heavy-duty black trash bag sitting on the floor. The sharp clatter of the cardboard sleeves hitting the bottom of the bag echoed in the empty room. A sudden sharp memory of Diane hit me. It was her last night in the hospital, the morphine haze softening the harsh reality of her failing body. She had held my hand, her grip surprisingly strong, and whispered, "Gordon, promise me you will always protect Connor. Promise me you will make sure he is okay." I had promised her. I had sworn on everything I held sacred that I would shield our son from the world. Watching Monica casually throw Diane's life into a garbage bag, I realized the terrible, crushing irony of that promise. I had protected Connor too much. I had shielded him from consequences, from hardship, from the very struggles that build character. I had smoothed every path, paid for every mistake, and provided a permanent safety net. In my desperate attempt to fulfill my wife's dying wish, I had not protected my son. I had crippled him. I had created a weak, entitled man whose only concept of problem-solving was theft. My overprotection had birthed the exact greed that was now trying to destroy me. Connor took my silence as confusion. He moved closer, placing a hand on my back to guide me toward the hallway. "Come on, Dad," he said, his voice dropping to that patronizing, syrupy whisper again. "Let's get you to your room. You just need to lie down and rest. The movers will handle the rest of this tomorrow." Every instinct in my body, every ounce of the auditor, who had spent 35 years exposing corporate fraud, screamed at me to confront them. I wanted to march into the kitchen, grab the phone, and call the police. I wanted to slam the bank folder onto the dining table, pull out the high-resolution copies of the forged power of attorney and the fake medical certificate, and watch their smug faces drain of color. I wanted to tell Connor that I knew he had stolen the $150,000 I had purposefully left vulnerable. I wanted to expose the entire operation right then and there, but I didn't. I knew that confronting them now would be a tactical error of catastrophic proportions. If I showed them my hand, if I revealed that I knew about the bank theft and the forged documents, they would simply accelerate their timeline. They would use the forged medical certificate to immediately file for an emergency conservatorship, claiming my accusations of theft were paranoid delusions brought on by advanced dementia. They had the paperwork. I only had my word against a doctor's signature. I needed more than just the bank records. I needed to understand the mechanics of their conspiracy. I needed to know who the corrupt doctor was, who the compromised notary was, and most importantly, why they were desperate enough to risk federal prison for a mere $150,000. So I made the conscious, strategic choice to weaponize my silence. I let my shoulders slump a fraction more. I allowed a slight noticeable tremor to enter my hands, mimicking the frail, deteriorating old man they needed me to be. I blinked rapidly, intentionally, breaking eye contact with Connor, projecting an image of bewildered compliance. "I suppose I am a little tired," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It has been a long morning." Connor's hand on my back tightened slightly, guiding me with a firm, almost eager pressure toward my bedroom door. "That is the spirit, Dad," he said cheerfully. "Just lie down and close your eyes. Monica and I will finish packing up the living room. You do not have to worry about a thing. We have got it all figured out." I turned away from him and shuffled toward my room, each step carefully measured to convey weakness. As I crossed the threshold, I glanced back at the living room. Monica was already taping another box shut, humming that same upbeat tune. Connor was standing in the hallway watching me. I caught his reflection in the hallway mirror just before I closed the door. The mask of the concerned, dutiful son had slipped completely. He was smirking. It was a cold, arrogant smirk, the expression of a man who believed he had just successfully executed the perfect crime. He thought he had won. He thought he had neutralized the only obstacle standing between him and my assets. I closed the bedroom door and heard the lock click into place. The sound of the packing tape ripping in the living room resumed, muffled by the solid wood. I stood in the center of my bedroom, surrounded by the familiar comfort of my own space, and let the frail old man persona drop completely. My hands stopped trembling. My posture straightened. The calculated confusion vanished, replaced by the cold, analytical focus that had defined my career. They wanted a vulnerable target. They wanted an old man who would quietly surrender his life and his legacy to a state-run facility while they liquidated his home. They had no idea that they had just activated an auditor who had spent his life dismantling complex financial conspiracies. They thought they had trapped me in a narrative of cognitive decline. But as I walked over to my desk and opened the bank folder, I knew the truth. They had not trapped me. They had simply handed me the playbook. The game had just begun, and they were playing against a master. I stood perfectly still in the center of my bedroom, listening intently to the muffled sounds of destruction filtering through the solid wood door. The rhythmic tearing of packing tape and the heavy thud of cardboard boxes hitting the hardwood floor in the living room formed a grim soundtrack to my isolation. Connor and Monica were moving quickly, emboldened by my supposed surrender. They truly believed I was lying in bed, a fragile shell of a man, succumbing to the dark fog of dementia they had so carefully fabricated. But my mind was clearer and sharper than it had been in years. The fog they relied upon did not exist. Instead, an icy, razor-sharp focus had taken its place. I walked past my bed, ignoring the heavy weariness that threatened to settle in my bones, and went straight to the walk-in closet. Behind a row of heavy winter coats, there was a false wooden panel built seamlessly into the wall. I had installed it myself over 20 years ago, back when Diane was still alive, and we wanted a secure place for our most sensitive documents. I slid the panel aside, revealing the cold steel face of a mechanical wall safe. It was an old model, the kind that required a precise physical turn of a heavy brass dial. I rested my fingers on the cold metal. 3 turns right, 2 turns left, 1 turn right. The heavy internal tumblers fell into place with a satisfying heavy click. I pulled the handle, swinging the thick steel door open, expecting to see the neatly organized stacks of manila envelopes I had left there just a month prior. The safe was practically empty. My breathing slowed as my eyes scanned the barren metal shelves. Diane's old pearl necklace was still there, sitting in its velvet box. A stack of old tax returns remained untouched. But the thick, red, reinforced envelope that held the original unencumbered deed to this house was gone. I reached further into the dark cavity of the safe, my hand searching for the small leather pouch that held my passport. It was also gone. My hands hovered in the empty space as the sheer magnitude of what this meant began to crystallize in my mind. They had not just stumbled upon my bank account. They had systematically raided my most secure private sanctuary. To crack a mechanical safe without the combination meant Connor had either spent hours meticulously manipulating the lock, or far more likely, he had watched me open it one day from the reflection of the bedroom mirror and memorized the turns. He had waited until I was out of the house, perhaps running a mundane errand, and he had invaded my private space to steal my identity and my property rights. I closed the safe door and pushed the false panel back into place, my jaw clenched so tightly my teeth ached. The missing passport was a tactical maneuver. Connor was a coward, but he was a calculating coward. By stealing my passport, he was ensuring that I could not leave the country. He was grounding me, stripping away my ability to travel or escape whatever legal net he was currently weaving around me. If I suddenly disappeared, he could claim I had wandered off in a state of cognitive decline, but without a passport, I could not legally vanish beyond his reach. But the missing deed was the true prize. This house, the home where I had carried my late wife over the threshold, was fully paid off. There was no mortgage, no liens, no debts attached to it. It was a pristine, untouched asset worth at least $800,000 in the current market. Connor and Monica did not just want the liquid cash they had drained from the bank that morning. $150,000 was merely the appetizer to fund their immediate lifestyle. The house was the main course. I turned away from his closet and walked back out into the main bedroom. That was when I noticed the subtle, invasive changes in the room. The drawers of my mahogany dresser were slightly ajar. My suits had been pushed haphazardly to one side of the closet. They had been in here searching for anything of value while I was at the bank. My eyes drifted to the small cherry wood nightstand beside my bed, and my blood ran completely cold. Resting perfectly in the center of the nightstand, deliberately placed where I could not possibly miss it, was a glossy, brightly colored brochure. I picked it up. The paper was cheap and thin. The cover featured a stock photograph of 2 smiling, silver-haired people sitting on a sunny park bench. Above them, printed in large, cheerful cursive letters, were the words, Sunset Pines Managed Care Facility. I stared at the brochure, my thumb tracing the edge of the cheap paper, as a profound and terrifying realization washed over me. I knew what Sunset Pines was. Anyone who lived in this county knew what Sunset Pines was. It was not a luxury retirement community. It was not a place with lush gardens and attentive, compassionate nurses. Sunset Pines was a notorious, underfunded state-run facility. It was a bleak, sterile warehouse where wards of the state were dumped when their families no longer wanted to deal with them. It was a place synonymous with neglect, smelling permanently of bleach and despair, where the elderly were kept heavily medicated in chemical straitjackets, so the underpaid staff would not have to hear them complain. My hands gripped the brochure tightly, crumpling the edges. The ultimate threat had just materialized in my hands. Connor and Monica were not just trying to steal my money. They were trying to legally erase my autonomy and condemn me to a living nightmare. My mind, trained for decades to dismantle complex corporate fraud, rapidly mapped out the entirety of their legal and financial conspiracy. The pieces snapped together with horrifying clarity. To sell an $800,000 house that was not in their name, Connor needed legal authority. The forged power of attorney they used at the bank was enough to drain a liquid account, but real estate required a far more rigorous legal threshold. Title companies and real estate attorneys would ask questions. They would require me to be present for the closing, or they would require a court-ordered conservatorship, proving I was entirely incapable of making my own decisions. That was why they needed the corrupt doctor. The medical note was the foundation of a conservatorship petition. Connor was planning to go before a judge and present himself as the weeping, dutiful son of a tragically senile father. He would use the forged medical documents to prove that I was a danger to myself. He would present my missing passport as proof that he needed to keep my documents safe. He would use the money he stole from my bank account to pay for the lawyers to facilitate the legal theft. Once a judge signed that conservatorship order, my life as an independent human being would be legally terminated. I would lose the right to vote, the right to hire a lawyer, the right to spend my own money, and the right to choose where I lived. Connor would become the absolute dictator of my existence. He would immediately liquidate my house funnel, the $800,000 of pure equity, into an account he controlled, and dump me into the squalor of Sunset Pines on government-subsidized Medicaid. He would leave me there to rot heavily medicated and forgotten, while he and Monica lived lavishly on the wealth I had built over a lifetime of hard work. I looked at the brochure again, staring at the fake, smiling faces on the cover. A wave of nausea hit me, followed immediately by a surge of white-hot, unforgiving rage. This was my son. The boy I had taught to ride a bicycle in the driveway out front. The boy whose college tuition I had paid in full so he would not have to start his life in debt. I had spent my entire adult life providing for him, protecting him, loving him. And in return, he was plotting to strip me of my humanity for a payout. He thought I was weak. He thought the grief of losing Diane and the creeping isolation of old age had made me an easy target. He believed that because I walked a little slower and spoke a little softer, my mind had dulled. He believed the illusion of the helpless old man that I had just projected for him in the living room. I dropped the crumpled brochure into the small trash can beside my bed. I did not need to read the details of the prison he had selected for me. I was never going to set foot in Sunset Pines. I walked over to the window and peered through the wooden blinds. The moving truck was still idling in the driveway. Connor and Monica were out there now, loading a stack of my heavy winter coats into the back of the truck. They were laughing about something, sharing a joke in the crisp afternoon air, completely unburdened by the monstrous crime they were committing. They were so confident, so utterly convinced of their own superiority. They had made a fatal miscalculation. They had assumed that the $150,000 in the local bank was the entirety of my financial existence. They had assumed that because I lived in a modest suburban home and drove a 10-year-old car, I was just a middle-class retiree clinging to a meager pension. They had no idea about the life I lived before I retired. They had no idea about the ruthless corporate battles I had fought, or the hidden resources I had accumulated. I stepped back from the window, letting the blinds fall shut. The time for playing the confused victim was over. I needed to leave the house, and I needed to do it without them seeing me. I needed to reach my own legal counsel. I needed to uncover the exact mechanics of their desperation. People do not risk federal prison for a few $100,000 unless they are backed into a terrifying corner. I needed to find out what kind of fire Connor was trying to put out with my money. I picked up a small, discreet duffel bag from the back of my closet and packed only the absolute essentials. A clean shirt, my encrypted laptop, and the bank folder containing the high-resolution evidence of their forgery. I slipped my phone into my pocket, ensuring it was completely silenced. I would not give them the satisfaction of a confrontation today. Let them pack my books. Let them tape up my boxes. Let them believe they had successfully erased Gordon Wallace from the board. They were about to learn that you never ever try to audit an auditor. I zipped the small, discreet duffel bag closed. The metallic sound of the zipper was easily masked by the heavy thud of footsteps and the ripping of packing tape echoing from the living room. Connor and Monica were moving back and forth from the house to the truck, their voices drifting through the open front door. I slipped my encrypted laptop and the thick bank folder inside the bag. I did not look back at the bedroom. I had spent 40 years building a life in this house, but sentimentality was a luxury I could no longer afford. Sentimentality was exactly what my son was counting on to keep me docile. I eased the bedroom window open, the one that faced the overgrown hedges of the backyard, and stepped out into the crisp autumn air. I moved with a quiet, deliberate pace, keeping low behind the wooden fence that separated my property from the neighbors. I could hear Connor laughing about something out front, completely unaware that his primary target had just slipped off the board. I walked 2 blocks down the quiet suburban street, the dry leaves crunching softly under my shoes, until I reached the busy main avenue. I did not use my personal cell phone to hail a ride. I flagged down a passing city cab, paid the driver in cash from my wallet, and told him to take me to the financial district downtown. The ride across the city gave me the time I needed to transition fully from a betrayed father into the corporate auditor I had been for decades. I watched the familiar neighborhoods roll past the window, but my mind was entirely focused on the mechanics of my son's crime. Stealing $150,000 from a parent was a despicable act, but risking federal wire fraud, forging medical documents, and attempting a hostile conservatorship required an entirely different level of motivation. It required absolute desperation. People do not orchestrate a multi-layered legal conspiracy just to buy a nicer car or take a lavish vacation. They do it because they are backed into a terrifying corner. Connor had a good job at a logistics firm. He made a decent salary. Yet he was willing to burn his life to the ground and risk federal prison for a relatively small, immediate payout and the eventual equity of my home. There was a missing variable in this equation, a raging fire he was desperately trying to extinguish with my money. I needed to know exactly what that fire was. The cab pulled up to a towering glass and steel building in the heart of the financial district. I walked through the revolving doors and took the private elevator up to the 42nd floor. The brass letters on the frosted glass doors read Reynolds and Associates. I did not have an appointment, but when the receptionist saw my face, she immediately picked up her phone. Less than a minute later, the heavy oak doors to the inner sanctum opened. Mr. Reynolds stood there. He was a man in his early 60s, impeccably dressed in a dark tailored suit with eyes that possessed the cold, calculating intelligence of a seasoned shark. He was not just an estate attorney. He was a legal assassin whom I had worked with during some of my most vicious corporate audits. He specialized in asset protection, hostile litigation, and utterly destroying people who tried to steal from his clients. "Gordon," he said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone, "it has been a long time. You look like a man preparing for a war." I followed him into his spacious corner office overlooking the city skyline. Sitting in one of the leather guest chairs was another man. He was younger, with a rugged, unassuming appearance and a thick manila folder resting on his lap. Reynolds introduced him as Mr. Shaw, one of the most ruthless and discreet private investigators in the state. Shaw was the kind of man who could dig up the buried secrets of a saint. I sat down opposite them, unzipped my duffel bag, and placed the bank folder squarely on the polished mahogany desk. I did not waste time with pleasantries or emotional outbursts. I laid out the exact sequence of events from the morning. I detailed the forged power of attorney, the fake medical certificate from the corrupt doctor, the drained accounts, and the moving truck currently parked in my driveway. I explained the aggressive gaslighting campaign and the brochure for the state-run nursing home that Monica had so thoughtfully left on my nightstand. Reynolds did not express shock or sympathy. He merely steepled his fingers, his eyes narrowing as he processed the legal implications of the forgery. Shaw leaned forward, picking up the high-resolution copies of the bank transfer and the fake medical note, studying the signatures with the trained eye of a skeptic. "Your son is incredibly foolish," Reynolds finally said, his tone dripping with professional disdain. "To commit wire fraud with a forged medical document is a direct ticket to federal prison. But why would he accelerate the timeline so aggressively? Why essentially kidnap you today?" I looked at both of them. "That is exactly what we are going to find out," I replied. "Connor is not a criminal mastermind. He is a coward. Someone or something is forcing his hand. He needs liquidity, and he needs it yesterday. The $150,000 he took this morning is a band-aid. The real prize is the equity in my home, which means whatever debt he is drowning in is massive. I turned my attention directly to Mr. Shaw. I need you to tear my son's life apart, I told the investigator. I want his bank records, his credit card statements, his phone logs. I want to know who he owes money to, who he is sleeping with, and what kind of leverage is being held over his head. Find out who this corrupt physician is and how much he was paid for that signature. Do not leave a single stone unturned. Shaw nodded slowly, slipping my documents into his own folder. Consider it done, Mr. Wallace. I will have a preliminary report for you by this evening. People who are this desperate always leave a sloppy trail. Reynolds poured 3 glasses of water from a crystal pitcher on his desk. We have a rapidly shrinking window, Gordon, the attorney warned. If they are moving this fast, they will file the conservatorship petition within days. Once a judge signs that order, untangling it will be a bureaucratic nightmare. You will lose your civil rights before we can even file an injunction. I took a slow sip of the cold water, feeling the auditor's adrenaline completely replace the father's grief. I know, I said quietly. That is why we are not going to untangle it. We are going to let them build their trap, and then we are going to drop the entire ceiling on their heads. I watch Mr. Shaw stand up from his chair. He gives me a curt, respectful nod and walks out of the office to begin his hunt. The heavy oak doors click shut behind him, sealing me inside the soundproof office with Reynolds. The ambient hum of the city traffic 42 floors below is the only sound in the room. Reynolds leans back in his leather chair. He studies me with a mixture of professional respect and grim reality. He folds his hands on his desk and asks me a very practical question. He wants to know how I plan to finance this counter-offensive. He points out that private investigators of Shaw's caliber emergency legal injunctions and scorched earth litigation require significant liquid capital. He knows my son just wiped out my local checking and savings accounts this morning. He assumes completely logically that my only remaining asset is the equity tied up in my house, which is currently under siege by a moving truck. I take another slow sip of water, letting the cold glass rest against my palm to steady my nerves. I tell Reynolds that the $150,000 Connor stole this morning was nothing more than a decoy. It was an operational expense account I kept locally for everyday convenience. Reynolds raises a gray eyebrow, his stoic demeanor cracking just a fraction. I lean forward, placing my hands flat on his polished mahogany desk, and tell him the exact numbers. I explain that over my 35-year career auditing international logistics networks, I did not just collect a standard corporate salary. I received heavy compensation in executive stock options, performance bonuses, and deferred equity. My late wife Diane and I lived quietly in that suburban house because we despised ostentatious wealth. We drove reliable, understated cars. We bought our clothes off the rack. We took modest vacations to national parks instead of luxury resorts abroad. We lived like average people, and meanwhile my portfolio compounded quietly in the shadows of the market. I tell Reynolds that I currently hold a fully shielded, irrevocable blind trust valued at $4.2 million. Reynolds sits perfectly still. A slow, predatory smile spreads across his face as he realizes the sheer magnitude of the mistake my son has just made. I explain exactly why I kept this vast fortune hidden. Diane and I made a solemn vow when Connor was in high school. We saw what happened to the children of my wealthy corporate colleagues. We watched them grow up soft, entitled, and utterly devoid of ambition. They floated through life waiting around for their parents to pass away so they could inherit empires they did not earn. We desperately wanted Connor to be hungry. We wanted him to experience the pride of earning his own living, of building his own foundation. So we buried the fortune. We told him my pension covered our basic needs and that the local bank account held our life savings. I let out a bitter, hollow laugh that echoes in the large office. The great tragedy is that my desperate attempt to build his character is exactly what fueled his greed. He looked at my decoy account, saw a finite number, and decided it was ripe for the taking. He thought he was robbing a vulnerable, deteriorating pensioner. He had absolutely no idea he was declaring war on a multimillionaire who spent decades tracing hidden funds and dismantling financial crimes for a living. I look Reynolds dead in the eye and authorize him to open the financial floodgates. I tell him to give Shaw a blank check. If the investigator needs forensic accountants to track down every single cent of Connor's offshore movements, hire them today. If he needs elite cybersecurity experts to pull the encrypted metadata off the forged medical certificate to prove exactly when and where it was created, pay their premium retainers immediately. I instruct Reynolds to begin drafting the legal frameworks for massive asset freezing defamation suits and civil fraud charges. I want a legal armory fully stocked, loaded, and ready to deploy the exact second Shaw brings me the leverage I need. I am weaponizing my life's work to dismantle my own son. Reynolds begins typing furiously on his keyboard. The rapid clicking sound of the keys echoes like a weapon being loaded. He stops and asks me where I plan to stay for the next few days. I cannot go back to the house while Connor and Monica are systematically boxing up my life. Returning now would force a premature confrontation, risking the element of surprise. Furthermore, if I am physically present, they might attempt to have their corrupt doctor forcibly sedate me or drag me into an evaluation to expedite their conservatorship petition. I need to remain a ghost until the trap is fully set. I tell Reynolds to book me a suite at a premium business hotel downtown under a corporate alias. I need a secure, anonymous base of operations with high-speed internet, absolute privacy, and zero chance of my son locating me. Reynolds makes a quick phone call to his assistant, arranging the accommodation in less than a minute. He assures me that the room is paid for through the law firm's discretionary fund to keep my name completely off the registry. Connor will believe I am wandering the streets in a haze of dementia, while in reality I am orchestrating his downfall from a penthouse suite. I stand up from the leather guest chair and pick up my small duffel bag. The emotional exhaustion of the day tries to pull at my limbs, trying to drag me down into the grief of losing my family. But the burning need for justice sears the grief away. I am no longer just a betrayed father mourning the loss of a son. I am an apex predator returning to his natural habitat. I have unlimited resources, unparalleled expertise, and a team of ruthless professionals at my immediate disposal. As I walk toward the heavy oak doors, Reynolds calls out to me. He says he has seen families tear each other apart for pennies, but he has never seen someone dig their own grave quite as deep as Connor just did. I do not smile. I just nod slowly. I tell Reynolds that my son wanted to play a high-stakes game of financial elimination, and I intend to oblige him. I step out into the hallway and wait for the private elevator, my mind already calculating the sheer velocity of the storm I am about to unleash on the people who thought they could bury me alive. I sat in the dim light of my corporate hotel suite, staring out at the sprawling city skyline. The heavy silence of the room was a stark contrast to the storm brewing in my mind. I had spent the last several hours pacing the thick carpet, drinking black coffee, and waiting for the private investigator to deliver his preliminary findings. My son had crossed a line that no sane person crosses without a terrifying reason. People do not forge medical documents and commit federal wire fraud just to upgrade their lifestyle. They do it because they are staring down the barrel of total ruin. I needed to know the exact nature of the fire my son was trying to extinguish with my money. Shortly before midnight, a sharp knock at the heavy oak door shattered the quiet. I opened it to find Mr. Shaw standing in the hallway holding a thick leather briefcase. I stepped aside to let him enter. He walked directly to the glass dining table in the center of the suite and began unpacking his findings. Shaw did not waste time with pleasantries. He laid out a series of printed bank statements, corporate ledger copies, and blurred surveillance photographs. He told me that my son was not just a greedy child looking for an early inheritance. My son was a desperate criminal backed into a lethal corner. Shaw explained that he had tapped into his network of forensic accountants and corporate insiders to trace the employment records of my son. He worked as a regional director for a large logistics firm. Over the past 8 months, he had orchestrated a massive and incredibly sloppy embezzlement scheme. He had created phantom vendors and routed company funds into offshore accounts, hoping to cover massive losses from a failed cryptocurrency venture. But he was not as smart as he believed. The internal auditors at his firm had caught the discrepancies just 3 weeks ago. My son was currently $200,000 in debt to his own employer. I stared at the documents spread across the glass table. The numbers told a story of absolute panic. $200,000 was a life-destroying sum for a man living paycheck to paycheck. If his employer handed those audit reports over to the federal authorities, my son would face decades in a federal penitentiary. The stolen $150,000 from my bank account was a frantic attempt to start paying back the stolen company funds. But it was not enough to cover the entire debt and keep him out of a prison cell. That was why they needed the deed to my house. They needed the $800,000 in pure equity to wipe the slate clean, silence his employer, and walk away free. But something in the explanation did not align with my own corporate experience. I looked across the table at the investigator. I told him that companies do not quietly wait for an embezzler to pay them back. When corporate auditors find a $200,000 hole, they freeze the employee out and call the authorities immediately to satisfy their insurance requirements. They do not give a regional director a 3-week grace period to magically find the missing funds. I told Shaw there was a missing variable in this equation. Someone at the very top of that company was holding the police at bay, and I needed to know why. Shaw let out a heavy sigh and pulled a secondary file from his briefcase. He told me that my instincts were entirely correct. He laid down a fresh series of photographs on the glass table. These were not financial documents. They were high-resolution surveillance images taken outside a luxury boutique hotel on the edge of the city. I looked down at the pictures and felt the last remaining shreds of my familial compassion evaporate into cold disgust. The photographs showed my daughter-in-law Monica. She was wearing a sleek evening dress and holding hands with a man who was easily 15 years older than her husband. Shaw explained that the man in the photographs was the chief executive officer of the logistics firm where my son worked. He was the man holding the audit reports. He was the man keeping the police from making an arrest. Shaw detailed the absolute depravity of the arrangement they had negotiated. When the embezzlement was discovered, Monica had stepped in to mediate. She had initiated a secret, ongoing affair with the chief executive officer to stall the criminal charges. She was quite literally sleeping with the boss to buy her husband the time he needed to steal my life savings and liquidate my home. I stood perfectly still, letting the sheer magnitude of their moral bankruptcy wash over me. My son had not just stolen from his employer. He had sold his own wife to his boss to avoid a prison sentence, and they were both actively conspiring to destroy my life to pay the ransom. Monica was playing the role of the devoted, concerned daughter-in-law in my living room, while simultaneously trading her dignity to keep her husband out of federal custody. The sickeningly sweet voice she had used to tell me it was moving day was the same voice she was using to placate a corrupt corporate executive. They were treating my life, my home, and my autonomy as poker chips in a degenerate game of blackmail and infidelity. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked down at the city streets far below. The grief of losing my family was entirely gone, replaced by the sterile, calculating mindset of an apex auditor preparing for a corporate execution. They were weak, terrified people making reckless decisions out of pure survival instinct. They believed they were incredibly clever, managing a complex web of deceit, forgery, and blackmail, but they had left a massive, glaring paper trail. The chief executive officer was an accomplice to extortion and compounding corporate fraud by burying an active embezzlement scheme in exchange for physical favors. If his board of directors found out, he would be ruined alongside my son. I turned back to the table and looked at Shaw. I told him he had done exceptional work. He had handed me the exact blueprint of their destruction. They were rushing the conservatorship hearing because the chief executive officer was running out of patience. The man wanted his $200,000, and Monica could only distract him for so long before he demanded the cash. The forged medical documents, the rapid packing of my home, the desperate bank withdrawal. It was all driven by a ticking clock set by a blackmailing boss. I gathered the photographs and the financial ledgers, placing them carefully into a secure folder. I knew exactly what I had to do next. I needed to let them confidently step into the legal trap they were building for me, and then I was going to use their own toxic secrets to burn their entire world to ashes. I instructed the private investigator to continue monitoring the boutique hotel and the corporate headquarters. I needed absolutely irrefutable proof of every single transaction and every illicit meeting. Shaw nodded his head and assured me that his team was already pulling the security camera footage from the hotel lobby to establish a timeline of the affair. He was also tracking the digital footprints of the chief executive officer to find the exact communications where the blackmail terms were established. I thanked him for his relentless efficiency and watched him leave the hotel suite. Once the heavy door clicked shut, I sat back down at the glass table and stared at the photographs of Monica and the corporate executive. My son and his wife had tried to strip me of my dignity because they had completely surrendered their own. They thought they were hunting a frail old man, but they had blindly wandered into the territory of a predator who understood the mechanics of ruin better than they ever could. The sun had barely begun to crest over the skyline when my secure hotel phone rang. It was Mr. Reynolds. He did not bother with pleasantries. He simply told me to get down to his office immediately. The cold urgency in his voice told me that the battlefield had shifted. I put on my suit, the armor I had worn for decades in corporate boardrooms, and took a private car back to the financial district. When I walked through the heavy oak doors of the law firm, Reynolds was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window. He did not offer me a seat. He did not offer me water. He turned around and slid a thick stack of legal documents across his polished mahogany desk. The top page bore the official seal of the State Family Court. It was an emergency ex parte petition for a permanent conservatorship. The petitioner was my son. Reynolds looked at me with grim intensity and delivered a massive blow. He told me that Connor had expedited the process using a legal loophole designed to protect vulnerable seniors in immediate physical danger. By claiming that I was wandering the streets and posing a profound risk to my own safety, Connor had successfully bypassed the standard waiting periods. The court had fast-tracked the case. The hearing was scheduled to take place in exactly 4 days, 96 hours. That was the entirety of the time I had left as a legally autonomous human being. I stared at the court summons, feeling the chilling reality of the ticking clock. Reynolds explained the sheer devastation of what would happen if we lost this hearing. The foundation of Connor's case rested entirely on the shoulders of the corrupt physician, Dr. Vance. The doctor had submitted a sworn affidavit attached to the petition, and he was scheduled to testify in person before the judge. Reynolds warned me that family court judges are inherently cautious. If a licensed medical professional stands in front of a judge and swears under oath that an elderly man is suffering from rapid cognitive decline, the judge will almost always err on the side of caution and grant the conservatorship. Once that judge brought the gavel down, the consequences would be immediate and irreversible. I would be stripped of my fundamental civil rights. My signature would become legally meaningless. I would lose the right to access my own trusts, the right to vote, and the right to choose where I lived. Most terrifying of all, Reynolds told me that I would lose the legal capacity to retain him as my attorney. I would become a ghost in the eyes of the law, entirely subjugated to the whims of the man who had just robbed me. Connor would have absolute dictatorial control over my life, my health care, and my assets. He could sell my home the very next morning and lock me inside Sunset Pines without anyone batting an eye. I told Reynolds that we already had the blackmail file from the private investigator. We had the photographs of Monica sleeping with the logistics executive. We had the financial ledgers proving Connor had embezzled $200,000 from his employer. I argued that exposing this motive would surely destroy his credibility in court, but Reynolds shook his head. He explained the harsh realities of the judicial system. Character assassination is common in family court. If we walked into the hearing with a folder full of circumstantial evidence about corporate embezzlement and infidelity, Connor's lawyers would simply object. They would claim that his professional debts were entirely separate from his father's failing health. They would argue that Connor was a flawed man who made financial mistakes, but that he was still a loving son desperately trying to protect his sick father from wandering into traffic. The judge might split the issues. As long as Dr. Vance maintained his medical assessment, the judge could still grant the conservatorship to protect my physical safety, effectively sealing my doom. To win this war, Reynolds told me we could not just rely on a paper trail of their motives. We needed to tie the medical fraud directly to the financial theft. We needed to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the medical evaluation itself was a purchased fabrication. We needed a smoking gun. My mind shifted into high gear processing the legal constraints and calculating the strategic angles. In the world of high-stakes corporate audits, when the paper trail is heavily obscured by clever accountants, you do not keep digging through the trash. You force the target to make a mistake in real time. You place them in a controlled environment, present them with a false reality, and you record their reaction. We needed undeniable proof of the conspiracy, and we needed it straight from their own mouths. We needed a recorded confession before that gavel dropped. I looked at Reynolds and asked him about the standard procedures for an emergency conservatorship. I noted that a preliminary doctor's note was enough to file the petition, but surely the court required a comprehensive, finalized psychiatric evaluation before making a permanent ruling. Reynolds nodded. He confirmed that Dr. Vance would need to conduct one final official assessment to solidify his testimony for the judge. This evaluation would have to take place in the next 48 hours. That was the opening I needed. I told Reynolds exactly what we were going to do. Connor and Monica still believed I was a broken, confused old man hiding in my bedroom. They believed the house was entirely their domain, a safe space where they could speak freely and execute their scheme without consequence. They were arrogant, and arrogance breeds profound carelessness. I told the attorney that I was going to leave the safety of the hotel suite. I was going to walk right back into my own house and step willingly into their trap. I would be waiting for Connor and Dr. Vance when they arrived for the final evaluation, but I would not be going in empty-handed. I instructed Reynolds to procure the most advanced, discrete audio and video recording equipment available on the private security market. I was going to wire my own living room. I was going to capture the entire conspiracy in high definition. Reynolds warned me of the immense risk. If I slipped up, if I showed too much clarity, or let my anger bleed through the facade, they would realize I was onto them. They would cancel the evaluation, alter their strategy, and perhaps resort to more drastic physical measures to silence me before the hearing. I buttoned my suit jacket and looked out the window at the sprawling city below. I told Reynolds not to worry about my performance. For 35 years, I had sat across from the most manipulative, deceitful corporate thieves in the world, playing the role of the quiet observer until the exact moment I dropped the hammer. I had 96 hours to secure my freedom. I was going back to my house, and I was going to let my son and his corrupt doctor hang themselves with their own words. I stepped out of the cab 2 blocks away from my house just as the sun began to dip below the tree line. I walked the rest of the way in the gathering shadows, making sure the large moving truck was gone. The driveway was empty. Connor and Monica had finished their pillaging for the day and returned to their own home, leaving me supposedly wandering the streets or locked in my bedroom in a state of terminal confusion. I used my original brass key to unlock the front door and stepped into the hollow shell of my living room. The silence was absolute. The packing boxes were stacked against the walls, but the core seating area remained untouched. I set my small duffel bag on the coffee table and unzipped it. Inside rested a piece of highly advanced surveillance equipment procured by the private investigator. It was a micro-lens camera and a high-definition audio transmitter wired to a localized digital storage drive. It was tiny, completely silent, and devastatingly effective. I walked over to the large oak bookcase near the front window. Monica had callously packed away the vintage records, but she had lazily ignored the bottom shelves, where I kept my dense, heavy volumes on corporate tax law and logistical accounting. Nobody ever looked at those books. I selected a massive leather-bound volume on international trade regulations. Using a sharp utility knife from the kitchen, I carefully hollowed out a rectangular cavity in the center of the dense pages. I worked with the steady, precise hands of a man who had spent a lifetime dissecting financial ledgers. I slid the camera and the transmitter into the hollow space and positioned the micro lens so it peered perfectly through a tiny opening in the spine of the book. I placed the volume back on the shelf, right at eye level. I took out my encrypted smartphone and linked it to the local wireless network of the camera. The screen flickered to life. The high-definition feed captured the entire living room perfectly, encompassing the sofa, the armchairs, and the coffee table. The audio feed was so sensitive I could hear the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I adjusted the book a fraction of an inch to optimize the viewing angle. I made sure the lens was virtually invisible unless someone was actively searching for it. The trap was set. It was a digital snare waiting to capture the exact moment my son and his corrupt physician crossed the point of no return. I closed the application, turned my phone to silent, and slipped it deep into my trouser pocket. I had exactly 40 minutes before Connor was scheduled to arrive. I needed to physically and mentally transform myself back into the broken, bewildered old man they expected to find. I went to the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face. I ruffled my gray hair so it stood up in uneven patches. I unbuttoned my collar and let my shirt hang slightly askew. I walked back into the living room and sat down in my worn fabric armchair, positioned perfectly in the center of the camera frame. I let my shoulders collapse inward, curving my spine to project frailty and defeat. I slowed my breathing until it sounded shallow and labored. I rested my hands on my knees, allowing a slight, rhythmic tremor to shake my fingers. I closed my eyes and waited in the silent house, listening to the relentless ticking of the clock. The sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway broke the silence. A car door slammed shut, followed by a second door. Heavy footsteps echoed on the concrete walkway leading to the front porch. I heard the metallic scrape of a key sliding into the deadbolt. The front door swung open. Connor walked into the living room, followed closely by a man I had never seen before. I kept my chin tucked to my chest, peering at them through half-closed eyes. I maintained the constant, subtle shaking in my hands. Connor looked around the room and let out a heavy, dramatic sigh when he saw me sitting in the armchair. He turned to the man behind him and whispered a complaint about how I had probably been sitting there all day in a daze. I slowly lifted my head and turned my gaze toward the stranger. This was Dr. Vance. The private investigator had briefed me thoroughly on the background of this man. He was not a respected medical specialist. He was a disgraced general practitioner drowning in malpractice lawsuits and staggering gambling debts. He looked exactly like a man who owed a massive amount of money to very dangerous people. His suit was expensive but badly rumpled. His tie was loose. A thin layer of nervous sweat glistened on his forehead, despite the cool autumn air inside the house. He clutched a leather briefcase tightly against his side as if it were a life preserver. His eyes darted nervously around the room, completely avoiding direct eye contact with me. He looked like a man who knew he was about to commit a terrible crime and was terrified of being caught in the act. Connor walked over to me with his hands clasped together, putting on his sickeningly sweet voice. He called out to me loudly and slowly, as if he were speaking to a toddler who was hard of hearing. He said he had brought a friend to see me. He introduced the sweating man as Dr. Vance and claimed the doctor was just here to ask a few simple questions to make sure I was feeling okay. I did not respond immediately. I let my eyes wander aimlessly around the room, as if I were struggling to process the words being spoken to me. I looked at the doctor and let my mouth hang open slightly, projecting total vacancy. Dr. Vance stepped forward, opening his briefcase and taking out a yellow legal pad and a silver pen. He cleared his throat and offered a tight, strained smile, telling me to just relax and that this evaluation would not take very long. I watched him click in his pen and knew that every single word spoken from this moment forward was being recorded in pristine high definition. The hunt had officially begun. Dr. Vance clicked his silver pen and looked down at his yellow legal pad. He did not look me in the eye. He started with the standard cognitive baseline questions. He asked me to state my full legal name, my date of birth, and the current year. He asked me to name the current president. He spoke very slowly, articulating each syllable as if he were trying to communicate across a massive language barrier. I answered him. I did not stutter. I did not hesitate. I gave him my full legal name, my exact date of birth, and the current date down to the day of the week. I named the president and then calmly named the vice president and the secretary of state, just to ensure my clarity was explicitly recorded on the hidden camera. I watched the doctor pause. His pen hovered over the paper. He glanced at Connor. Connor shifted his weight from one foot to the other, crossing his arms tightly over his chest. Dr. Vance cleared his throat and adjusted his collar. He tried a different angle. He leaned forward and adopted a tone of deep, artificial sympathy. He told me that Connor had expressed some serious concerns about my memory lately. He asked me if I ever felt confused about my finances. He asked if I sometimes forgot where I put my money, or if I felt overwhelmed by paying my daily bills. It was a classic leading question. It was designed to trick me into admitting vulnerability. If I said yes, he would document financial incompetence. If I got angry and shouted that my son stole my money, he would document paranoia and aggressive delusions. I kept my voice perfectly level and pleasant. I told Dr. Vance that I managed my finances with absolute precision. I explained that I spent 35 years as a senior corporate auditor. I told him that I track every single cent that enters and leaves my accounts. I looked directly into his sweating face and stated that I knew exactly where my $150,000 went that morning. I told him the exact time the wire transfer was initiated at the local bank branch. I did not accuse Connor. I simply stated the facts with chilling objective accuracy. Dr. Vance swallowed hard. A heavy bead of sweat formed at his temple and slowly rolled down the side of his face. He tugged at his collar again. He looked down at his legal pad, but he was not writing anything. He realized instantly that I was not a confused old man suffering from dementia. He realized he was sitting across from a highly intelligent, highly observant individual who missed absolutely nothing. Connor stepped forward, trying to salvage his crumbling narrative. He told the doctor that I was just making things up again. He said that I often fabricated elaborate stories to cover up my memory lapses. Connor insisted that my financial confusion was exactly why they needed to transition me into a managed care facility. Dr. Vance seized the fragile lifeline Connor threw him. He gestured nervously to the cardboard boxes stacked against the living room walls. He asked me if the moving process was causing me severe anxiety. He asked if I felt disoriented by all the changes happening in my home. He was trying to establish that my environment was chaotic, and that I was incapable of maintaining a stable household. I uncrossed my legs and sat up a fraction of an inch straighter. I let the frail persona slip just enough to let my true authority bleed into the room. I looked Dr. Vance dead in the eye and held his gaze. I told him that I was not moving anywhere. I explained that I owned this property free and clear with no mortgage and no liens. I asked him in a very calm, very clinical tone if he made a habit of diagnosing patients based on the unauthorized packing of their belongings by third parties. The doctor flinched, as if I had physically struck him. His silver pen slipped from his fingers and clattered loudly onto the hardwood floor. He scrambled to pick it up, his hands visibly shaking. He was a man drowning in debt who had likely been promised a significant payout for signing a simple piece of paper. But he was suddenly realizing the sheer scale of the legal liability he was stepping into blindly. I did not let up the pressure. I kept my voice smooth and conversational, but I laced every word with heavy legal terminology. I asked Dr. Vance if he was familiar with the federal penalties for medical fraud. I casually mentioned the strict guidelines established by the State Medical Board regarding emergency conservatorship evaluations. I asked him if he felt confident staking his entire medical license on a 15-minute conversation in a living room without conducting a proper neurological scan or a comprehensive blood panel. I was not yelling. I was speaking to him the exact same way I used to speak to embezzling executives moments before their careers ended in handcuffs. I was calmly and methodically dismantling his professional safety net. Dr. Vance looked absolutely terrified. He looked at Connor with wide, panicked eyes. He started stammering helplessly. He said that maybe they should reschedule the evaluation for another day. He suggested that perhaps a more comprehensive clinical setting would be appropriate. He was trying to back out. He wanted to pack his leather briefcase and run out the front door before he committed a felony on the record. Connor saw his entire plan collapsing in real time. He stepped between me and the doctor, his face flushed with sudden, desperate anger. He told Dr. Vance that they did not have time to reschedule. He insisted that the doctor had already been paid for his services and that he needed to finish the paperwork today. Connor was losing his temper, and in his sheer desperation, he was openly admitting to a financial transaction tied to the medical evaluation. The hidden camera in the hollowed-out bookshelf captured every single desperate self-incriminating syllable. I sat quietly in my armchair, watching them turn on each other. Dr. Vance was wiping his forehead with a handkerchief, shaking his head, and whispering that he could not sign a declaration of incompetence for a man who was clearly in full possession of his mental faculties. He told Connor that I was far too sharp and that any family court judge would see right through the emergency petition. The trap was working flawlessly. The corrupt doctor was cracking under the psychological pressure of a simple conversation. My son was panicking, exposing his own coercive tactics. The audio and video feeds were recording a masterpiece of self-destruction. I had them exactly where I wanted them. But I knew that if Dr. Vance walked out that door without signing the paperwork, Connor would simply find another doctor. He would find someone even more corrupt, someone who would sign the papers without even bothering to visit the house. I needed this specific doctor to sign this specific document right now so I could tie them all together in federal court. I needed to execute a strategic failure. I needed to give them a reason to believe they could still win. I watched Dr. Vance reach for the brass clasp of his leather briefcase. His knuckles were white. His breath was coming in short, anxious bursts. He was terrified. I had applied too much pressure. I had let the corporate auditor bleed too far into the living room, and now the corrupt physician was preparing to flee. He was calculating the risk to his medical license and realizing the payout was not worth a federal indictment. Connor was stepping into his path, blocking the door, raising his voice in a desperate attempt to keep the man from leaving. I sat in my armchair observing the collapse of their fragile alliance. A cold realization washed over me. I had made a tactical error. If I terrified this doctor into walking out that door, the trap would spring empty. I needed his signature. I needed that forged medical affidavit submitted to the state court to trigger the massive federal fraud charges. To catch a thief, sometimes you have to leave the vault door wide open and turn off the lights. I needed to execute a strategic failure. I needed to give them a reason to believe they were still in complete control. I took a slow breath and initiated a total system shutdown of my commanding presence. I commanded my muscles to loosen completely. I let my shoulders slump heavily against the worn fabric of the armchair, curving my spine to project absolute defeat. I unfocused my eyes, letting my gaze drift aimlessly toward the ceiling. I forced my hands to shake. I did not use the subtle tremor from before. I produced a violent, uncontrollable rattling of genuine panic. I let my jaw go slack. I interrupted Connor mid-sentence. I did not speak with the cold authority of an investigator. I let my voice crack. I made it thin, reedy, and high-pitched. I looked at the cardboard boxes stacked against the living room wall and let out a confused whimper. I asked who had put those boxes in my house. I asked where my wife was. I called out for Diane, letting a note of profound, childlike terror bleed into my words. I asked if Diane was in the kitchen, complaining that she had not brought me my afternoon tea. I told them I was very cold and did not understand why the furniture was moving. The effect in the room was instantaneous. The heated argument between my son and the doctor stopped dead. The tense silence hung heavy, broken only by my deliberate, shallow panting. I looked directly at Dr. Vance with wide, pleading eyes. I asked him if he was the man who came to fix the television set. I told him the year was 1998 and that I needed to leave right now to pick my son up from baseball practice. I begged him to help me find my car keys so I would not be late. I watched the physical tension drain out of Dr. Vance. His rigid shoulders dropped. The sheer terror of facing a legal mastermind evaporated in an instant, replaced by the profound relief of facing an easy, vulnerable target. He let go of the handle of his briefcase. He reached down and picked up his silver pen from the hardwood floor. He wiped the heavy sweat from his brow with the back of his hand and let out a long, shuddering breath. He had his justification. The threat of medical fraud was no longer a risk in his mind. It was now just a simple, routine observation of a rapidly deteriorating mind. Connor stepped away from the doctor. The panic that had gripped my son just moments before vanished entirely. His posture shifted. He stood tall, puffing out his chest, completely reassured of his dominance. He looked down at me and the cold, arrogant smirk returned to his face. He truly believed that my brief moment of clarity had been nothing more than a random lucid spike, a final misfiring of dying brain cells before the dark fog of dementia reclaimed me permanently. Monica walked into the living room from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She had heard my performance perfectly. She walked over to Connor and slipped her arm through his, leaning her head against his shoulder. She looked at me with that same manufactured, sickeningly sweet pity. She turned to the doctor and told him that this was exactly what they dealt with every single day. She claimed that I had aggressive paranoid outbursts followed immediately by severe confusion and memory loss. She lied with such effortless grace that it cemented my absolute resolve to destroy her life. Dr. Vance nodded sympathetically, entirely willing to buy into the illusion. He sat back down on the edge of the sofa and placed the yellow legal pad on his knee. He began writing furiously, documenting my supposed cognitive collapse. I sat in my chair trembling and mumbling Diane's name while internally I was taking meticulous tactical notes. I was memorizing the exact time, the exact positioning of their bodies, and the exact lies they were spinning. The hidden camera in the hollowed-out book on the shelf was capturing a masterpiece of elder abuse in pristine high definition. Connor walked over to my chair and patted me on the head. He did it the way one might pat a confused elderly dog. He told me to hush, saying that Diane was out at the grocery store and would be back soon. He spoke to me with a level of deep disrespect that burned in my chest, but I kept my breathing erratic and my eyes unfocused. I let him bask in his false victory. I let him feel the intoxicating rush of absolute, unearned power. Dr. Vance finished writing his notes. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick, official-looking document. I recognized the state seal printed at the top. It was the medical affidavit for the emergency conservatorship petition. He clicked his silver pen and signed his name at the bottom of the page with a heavy flourish. He handed the document directly to Connor. He told my son that the paperwork was complete and that the family court judge would have no choice but to grant the petition based on my severe cognitive decline and inability to care for myself. Connor took the paper. His eyes shined with naked predatory greed. He held the key to my $800,000 house and my total legal destruction right there in his hands. He shook the doctor's hand, thanking him for his time and his professional discretion. Monica smiled, her eyes darting toward the cardboard boxes, clearly calculating how fast they could liquidate my life to pay off her wealthy lover. They had swallowed the bait completely. The strategic collapse was a total, unmitigated success. I remained slumped in my chair, playing the fool, knowing with absolute certainty that their breathtaking arrogance had just permanently sealed their fate. The heavy oak front door clicked shut. Dr. Vance was gone, taking his leather briefcase and his compromised medical license with him. I remained slumped in my armchair. I let my chin rest heavily against my chest and slowed my breathing into the deep, rhythmic cadence of a man who had fallen fast asleep. In reality, every nerve in my body was firing with absolute precision. I listened to the sound of Connor turning the deadbolt. I heard his heavy footsteps returning to the living room. He walked right up to my chair and stood over me. I could feel his shadow falling across my face. I did not flinch. I did not alter my breathing. I played the exhausted, broken old man flawlessly. Connor let out a long breath and walked away. He moved toward the center of the room where Monica was standing near the cardboard boxes. The sickeningly sweet persona Monica had worn for the doctor evaporated the second she believed they were alone. I kept my eyes closed, but my ears captured every single word. "We have the medical paperwork," Connor said, his voice dropping the false sympathy and adopting a harsh, urgent edge. "We just need to file it in the morning. The judge will grant the conservatorship by Friday." Monica did not sound relieved. She sounded furious. She told Connor that Friday was not fast enough. She kept her voice low, but the acoustics of the half-empty living room carried her words directly to my ears, and more importantly, directly into the hidden microphone in the hollowed-out book on the shelf. She told him that she had spent 2 hours on the phone with his boss yesterday. She said the chief executive officer was losing his patience. She explicitly stated that she could not keep sleeping with a man twice her age just to keep her husband out of a federal penitentiary. My son let out a sharp, bitter laugh. He told her not to act like a martyr. He reminded her that she was the one who suggested they use her affair as leverage to stall the corporate auditors. He told her that he was doing everything he could to fix the massive hole he had dug. He admitted out loud and in perfectly clear audio that he had forged my signature on the bank transfer that very morning. He complained about how stressful it was to fake the power of attorney documents. He said that stealing the $150,000 from my account barely covered the interest on his failed investments. Monica paced the hardwood floor. I heard the sharp click of her designer heels pacing back and forth. She told Connor that the bank money was a drop in the bucket. She explicitly stated that the boss wanted the full $200,000 returned to the corporate accounts by the end of the week, or he was going to hand the embezzlement files over to the authorities. She said they needed to list this house for sale tomorrow. She coldly calculated that an $800,000 property would sell for cash in a matter of days if they priced it low enough. She said they could pay off the boss, bury the embezzlement charges permanently, and still have $500,000 left over to start a new life. Connor agreed. He looked over at me. I heard his footsteps approach my chair again. He said that once the judge signed the papers on Friday morning, they would drop me off at Sunset Pines. He said I would not even know where I was after a few days of their institutional medication. He spoke about my life, my freedom, and my dignity, as if he were discussing how to dispose of an old, broken appliance. They stood right in front of the camera lens, laying out their entire criminal conspiracy from start to finish. They admitted to the embezzlement. They admitted to the affair. They admitted to the forgery. They admitted to the premeditated theft of my home. They handed me the absolute, undeniable proof I needed to destroy them. A few minutes later, Monica told Connor she was leaving to go back to their apartment. She said she could not stand the smell of old people and mothballs in my house for another second. Connor told her he would stay behind for another hour to pack up the valuable silver in the dining room, just in case I woke up and tried to wander outside again. The front door opened and closed as Monica left. I remained perfectly still in my chair while Connor rummaged through the dining room cabinets. My mind was processing the vast mountain of evidence I had just acquired. I had the smoking gun. If I took this recording to Mr. Reynolds right now, we could walk into the police station and have Connor and Monica arrested before midnight. The authorities would seize the forged documents. The emergency conservatorship hearing would be canceled. I would be safe. But as I listened to the clinking of my late wife's silver being tossed carelessly into a cardboard box, the corporate auditor inside me rejected that plan. Calling the police was a quiet, bureaucratic solution. It would shield them from public ruin. Connor would hire a defense attorney. He would drag the process out for years. Monica would likely betray him, cutting an immunity deal by testifying against him. The chief executive officer would quietly resign with a golden parachute, to avoid the scandal of his affair. They would all find a way to minimize the damage. I did not want to minimize the damage. I wanted total, catastrophic, irrevocable annihilation. I wanted to burn their reputations to ash so thoroughly that they would never be able to show their faces in polite society again. I reviewed the timeline in my head. Today was Wednesday. The court hearing was scheduled for Friday morning, but tomorrow was Thursday. Thursday night was a very specific, very important night in the corporate calendar of Connor's logistics firm. I knew this because I had audited similar firms for decades. The end of the fiscal quarter meant one thing: the annual executive gala. It was a lavish, highly publicized event, hosted at the Grand Ballroom downtown. The entire board of directors would be in attendance. Major investors, regional managers, and industry leaders would be drinking champagne and celebrating their corporate success. Connor would be there dressed in a tuxedo, playing the role of the rising star in the logistics department. Monica would be there wearing an expensive gown, smiling on the arm of her husband, while secretly exchanging glances with the chief executive officer. They would feel powerful. They would feel untouchable. They would believe they were just hours away from cashing in my life to save their own. It was the absolute perfect venue for an execution. I waited patiently until Connor finished raiding the dining room. He grabbed his coat, walked past my chair without a second glance, and let himself out the front door. The heavy lock clicked into place. I opened my eyes. The living room was empty and bathed in the dim light of dusk. I stood up. I did not shuffle. My joints did not ache. I walked over to the hollowed-out book on the shelf and retrieved the digital storage drive. It felt heavy in my hand, dense with the weight of their ruined futures. I slipped it into my pocket, grabbed my duffel bag, and left the house through the back door. I took a private car back to the secure hotel suite in the financial district. Mr. Reynolds and the private investigator were waiting for me in the room. I set the storage drive on the glass dining table. I told them we had the confession. I told them we had the motive, the means, and the full admission of guilt on pristine audio and video. Reynolds smiled and reached for his phone to call the district attorney. I placed my hand over his and told him to wait. I explained my new plan. I told the ruthless estate attorney that we were not going to the police tonight. I told him we were going to crash an executive gala tomorrow night. We were going to present the evidence not just to the authorities, but to the entire board of directors, the investors, and the elite society my son so desperately craved. We were going to strip away their freedom, their wealth, and their dignity, all at exactly the same moment. Reynolds leaned back in his chair. A slow, deeply satisfied smile spread across his face. He told me to get some rest. He said he was going to make a few phone calls to ensure we had the proper police escort for our uninvited appearance at the ballroom. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out at the glittering lights of the city. I was not a frail old man waiting to be discarded. I was the architect of their absolute destruction, and tomorrow night I was going to bring the hammer down. I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in the secure hotel suite and watched the final remnants of the frail old man disappear. There were no trembling hands today. There was no slumped posture or vacant stare. I slowly buttoned a crisp white shirt and slipped on a custom-tailored charcoal suit I had not worn since my final board meeting 5 years ago. The heavy premium fabric settled perfectly over my frame, restoring the broad, authoritative silhouette I had maintained throughout my entire corporate career. I adjusted my silk tie with steady, precise fingers. The confused, terrified victim they had laughed at in my living room was completely gone. In his place stood a senior corporate auditor who had spent 3 decades hunting down arrogant thieves and dismantling their lives. Mr. Reynolds stood near the heavy oak door holding his polished leather briefcase. He checked his watch and gave me a curt, professional nod. It was time. The black town car glided smoothly through the glowing downtown streets toward the financial district. I watched the city lights blur past the tinted windows, letting the cold, calculated focus of my profession take complete control of my mind. Tonight was the end of the fiscal quarter for the logistics firm where my son worked. It was their night to celebrate profit margins, to distribute executive bonuses, and to revel in their own corporate success. I knew exactly the kind of atmosphere waiting for us inside that venue. There would be crystal chandeliers casting warm light over towering ice sculptures. There would be endless trays of expensive champagne circulated by waiters in crisp uniforms. Men in fitted tuxedos and women in designer gowns would be patting each other on the back, toasting their brilliant futures. Connor would be standing right in the middle of it all. I could picture him perfectly. He would be holding a crystal flute, laughing confidently, playing the role of the rising corporate star. He would feel entirely untouchable. Monica would be right beside him, wearing an expensive gown, smiling at the wives of the board members, while secretly tracking the movements of the chief executive officer across the room. She would be waiting for the right moment to catch her wealthy lover's eye, to silently assure him that his $200,000 was just days away from being deposited. They thought they had outsmarted a dying old man. They thought they had secured an $800,000 payday. They believed with absolute certainty that the worst of their problems were behind them, and that tomorrow morning a judge would hand them the keys to my entire life. The town car pulled up to the velvet ropes at the entrance of the grand ballroom. I stepped out into the cool night air. The valet rushed forward to open the glass doors, but I bypassed him entirely. I walked up the marble steps with measured, purposeful strides. Two men in sharp, dark suits were waiting for us in the expansive lobby. They were not corporate executives attending the gala. They were senior detectives from the Financial Crimes Division. Reynolds had briefed them thoroughly earlier in the day, showing them the forged medical documents, the fraudulent wire transfers, and the high-definition video confession I had captured in my living room. The detectives were not here to ask questions or conduct an investigation. The investigation was over. They were here to make arrests. One of the detectives, a tall man with a stern, uncompromising expression, approached me. He confirmed that the federal warrants were signed and active. He asked if I was ready to proceed. I did not smile. I did not hesitate. I simply nodded. We walked together down the long carpeted corridor toward the main ballroom. The beautiful sound of a live string quartet playing a classical piece drifted through the heavy mahogany doors. The muffled chatter of 200 wealthy elites blended into a low, steady hum of arrogance and privilege. I placed my hand on the cold brass handle of the door. I took one final breath, shedding the last lingering trace of the father who had loved a son, and fully embracing the auditor about to execute a target. I pushed the heavy doors open. The brass hinges were completely silent. I stepped onto the plush carpet of the grand ballroom, flanked by Reynolds on my left and the two plainclothes detectives on my right. We did not sneak in through the back. We did not wait politely by the coat check. We walked straight down the center aisle, cutting a direct path through the crowded room. I kept my spine perfectly straight, my head held high, and my gaze locked dead forward. My presence commanded immediate, absolute attention. People naturally stepped out of our way, parting like a physical wave. The light conversation in our immediate vicinity began to falter. The silence spread outward in a rapid, rippling effect as guests turned to stare at the four men marching into their celebration with the grim, undeniable authority of an execution squad. I scanned the room with a cold, clinical eye. It took less than 10 seconds to find my target. Connor was standing near the center of the room by a towering pyramid of champagne glasses. He had one hand tucked casually into the pocket of his tuxedo trousers and the other holding a drink. He was laughing loudly at something a senior regional manager had just said, desperately trying to maintain the illusion of his own success. Monica was standing right beside him, wearing a stunning emerald green gown, her hand resting lightly and affectionately on his arm. She was the absolute picture of a devoted, supportive wife, masking the rot underneath. The wave of silence sweeping through the ballroom finally reached their circle. Connor noticed the sudden drop in conversation and the shifting attention of his colleagues. He turned his head toward the entrance. I watched his eyes track across the room and land squarely on me. I watched the exact millisecond his brain tried to process the impossible reality of what he was seeing. He expected a frail, confused man locked in a suburban bedroom, mumbling about the past and waiting to be shipped off to a state-run facility. Instead, he saw a corporate titan in a bespoke suit marching toward him with an entourage of law enforcement. The crystal champagne flute slipped from his trembling fingers. It hit the polished marble floor with a sharp, shattering crash that echoed like a gunshot in the sudden, deathly quiet of the ballroom. The pale golden liquid splashed wildly across his expensive leather shoes. Monica whipped her head around, annoyed by the sudden, loud disruption. Her eyes followed his terrified gaze and locked onto my face. The blood drained from her cheeks so fast she looked like a corpse. Her hand dropped from his arm as if she had been burned. She took a reflexive, staggering step backward, her mouth falling open in a silent scream. I did not stop. I did not slow my pace. I walked right up to them, stopping barely 3 feet away. The string quartet at the far end of the room finally noticed the suffocating tension and faltered, dragging their bows awkwardly across the strings before fading into total silence. 200 pairs of eyes were fixed entirely on us, watching the drama unfold. Connor opened his mouth to speak, but his jaw just trembled uselessly. He could not form a single coherent word. He looked at my crisp, tailored suit, he looked at my steady hands, and he looked at the cold, unyielding fury in my eyes. The illusion he had built, the entire foundation of his theft and his arrogance, shattered right there on the ballroom floor, alongside his broken glass. He knew in that singular, terrifying moment that he had not trapped me at all. He had just been lured into his own public execution. The shattered crystal from Connor's dropped glass lay scattered across the polished marble floor. Nobody moved to clean it up. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute, a suffocating vacuum of tension. I stood 3 feet away from my son, watching his chest heave with panicked, shallow breaths. He looked like a cornered animal desperately waiting for a way out that did not exist. From the periphery of the stunned crowd, a tall man with silver hair and an expensive tuxedo pushed his way to the front. This was Mr. Carmichael, the chief executive officer of the logistics firm. He was a man used to absolute control, and his face was flushed with anger at the sudden disruption of his prestigious event. He opened his mouth, ready to demand that security remove me and the detectives from his ballroom. But as he took a step forward, his eyes locked onto my face. His furious expression vanished instantly. It was replaced by a look of profound shock and deep professional reverence. He did not look at me and see Connor's frail, declining father. He recognized me immediately. He stopped dead in his tracks and breathed my name out loud. The murmurs rippled through the crowd. Carmichael turned to his board of directors who were gathered near the stage and told them exactly who I was. He announced that I was the legendary senior auditor who had single-handedly dismantled a massive supply chain fraud that nearly bankrupted their firm 15 years ago. He told them I was a ghost in the corporate world, a man who only appeared when a company was bleeding money from the inside. Connor stared at his boss, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocated fish. He looked back at me, the blood draining completely from his face as the crushing reality of my actual identity finally pierced his arrogant delusion. He had never known. I had never told him. I did not acknowledge Carmichael's praise. I walked past my son, stepping carefully over the shattered glass, and made my way directly to the small stage at the front of the room. A sleek microphone stood on a podium, waiting for the quarterly toast. I stepped up to it. I looked out over the sea of wealthy executives, regional managers, and wealthy investors. Then I looked down at Connor and Monica. When I spoke into this microphone, my voice was ice cold. It did not echo with anger. It resonated with the terrifying clinical precision of an auditor delivering a final, fatal verdict. I told the board of directors that they had no reason to celebrate tonight. I informed them that their end-of-quarter financial reports were completely compromised. I stated that they currently had a $200,000 deficit hiding in their offshore accounts, masked by a network of phantom vendors and falsified logistical invoices. The ballroom erupted in shocked gasps. Board members exchanged terrified, frantic glances. I pointed my finger directly at Connor. He flinched as if I had shot him. I told the entire room that their rising star, the regional director standing paralyzed in the center of their gala, was a desperate thief. I laid out the exact methodology of his embezzlement. I detailed how he had funneled company capital into a disastrous cryptocurrency venture, lost every single cent, and spent the last 8 months desperately altering internal ledgers to cover his tracks. Connor shook his head wildly, trying to form a denial, but his voice completely failed him. He was drowning in front of 200 people. I was not finished. I turned my attention away from my son and locked eyes with Mr. Carmichael. The chief executive officer swallowed hard, the color draining from his face as he realized he was in the crosshairs. I spoke directly to him over the microphone, projecting my voice so every single person in the room could hear the absolute rot at the core of their leadership. I asked Carmichael why the internal auditors had caught this massive discrepancy 3 weeks ago, yet the police had never been called. I asked him why the board of directors had been kept completely in the dark about a massive internal theft. The chief executive officer took a step backward, raising his hands in a weak defensive gesture. He stammered that it was an internal human resources matter, that they were handling it privately. I leaned closer to the microphone and told the entire room exactly how he was handling it. I pointed my hand toward Monica. She was shrinking into herself, trying to hide behind the other guests, her emerald green gown suddenly looking like a prison uniform. I told the board of directors that their chief executive officer was actively burying federal crimes in exchange for physical favors. I detailed the secret meetings at the boutique hotel on the edge of the city. I stated the exact dates, the exact times, and the exact room numbers they had booked. I explained that Monica had traded her dignity to her husband's boss to buy Connor the time he needed to find $200,000 to replace the stolen company funds. The collective gasp from the audience was deafening. Investors glared at Carmichael with absolute disgust. Wives of the executives whispered furiously to each other, looking at Monica with unshielded revulsion. The illusion of their sophisticated, successful lives was ripped away, exposing the pathetic, greedy reality underneath. Mr. Reynolds, my attorney, stepped forward. He held out the thick manila folder containing the financial ledgers, the hotel surveillance photographs, and the metadata from the corrupt physician. I took the folder from him and held it up for the entire room to see. I looked down at my son. He was weeping openly now, tears streaming down his face, his perfect tuxedo completely irrelevant. I explained to the crowd exactly where Connor planned to get the ransom money. I told them that this morning my son and his wife had walked into my local bank. I detailed how they had presented a forged power of attorney and a falsified medical document declaring me mentally incompetent. I told the room that my own flesh and blood had legally hijacked my identity and drained my checking account of $150,000. I opened the folder and pulled out the crisp, high-resolution bank receipts. I handed them directly to the 2 police detectives standing at the base of the stage. The documents proved exactly where the money had gone. They showed the wire transfer originating from my stolen account and depositing directly into an intermediary corporate holding account controlled entirely by Mr. Carmichael. I told the board that their chief executive officer was not just an adulterer. He was an active accomplice to extortion, wire fraud, and the financial abuse of an elderly man. He was holding the embezzlement charges over my son's head, forcing Connor to steal his own father's life savings to pay the blackmail. The silence that followed was heavy and final. The music was gone. The clinking of glasses was gone. The arrogant smiles were gone. I stood at the podium and looked at the 3 people who had plotted to throw me into a decaying state-run nursing home. They were completely surrounded by law enforcement, outraged investors, and a furious board of directors. They had nowhere to run. They had no lies left to tell. The public execution was absolute. The sheer weight of the silence in the grand ballroom finally broke my son. Connor lunged forward, his face twisted into a mask of pure, desperate panic. He pointed a trembling finger at me and screamed to the room. He shouted that I was insane. He yelled that my mind was completely gone, that I was suffering from severe dementia, and that everything I had just said was a paranoid delusion. He looked frantically at his board of directors, begging them not to listen to a sick old man. He screamed that I was under a legal conservatorship, that a licensed doctor had signed the paperwork just yesterday, and that he had the legal authority to manage my life because I no longer knew what was real. I did not raise my voice to argue with him. I did not need to. I simply stepped back from the podium and let my attorney take the floor. Mr. Reynolds walked forward with the calm, terrifying grace of a predator closing in on a trapped meal. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a small silver flash drive. He held it up for the police detectives and the entire ballroom to see. He announced that this drive contained continuous high-definition video and audio. He explained that it was recorded in my living room less than 24 hours ago. Reynolds told the detectives exactly what they would find on that drive. He stated they would hear Connor explicitly admitting to forging my signature on the bank transfers. They would hear him discussing the payment made to a corrupt physician to falsify a medical affidavit. They would hear Monica detailing her affair with Mr. Carmichael to stall the embezzlement charges. They would hear the two of them coldly calculating the sale of my home to pay a ransom while planning to lock me inside a state-run facility to keep me quiet. Reynolds handed the flash drive directly to the lead detective. He stated that it was not the delusion of a sick old man. It was the recorded confession of a federal conspiracy. The lead detective did not hesitate. He signaled to his partner. The two officers moved swiftly across the polished marble floor. Connor tried to step backward, but his legs failed him. He stumbled, bumping into a cocktail table and sending a tray of expensive appetizers crashing to the ground. The detective grabbed Connor by the arm, spun him around, and slammed his wrists together. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs echoing in the silent ballroom was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. A second later, the other detective placed handcuffs on Monica. She did not scream. She just collapsed to her knees in her elegant emerald gown, sobbing uncontrollably, as the reality of a federal prison sentence crashed down upon her. Mr. Carmichael was surrounded by his own board of directors, who were already loudly demanding corporate counsel and security to escort him out of the building. Connor was breathing heavily, tears streaming down his flushed face as the detective held him in place. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a pathetic, begging sorrow. He asked me how I could do this to my own flesh and blood, over $150,000. He cried that it was my entire life savings, that I would have nothing left to live on, and that we were both ruined now. I walked slowly down the steps of the stage. I walked right up to my son, standing close enough to see the sweat dripping from his chin. I looked at him with absolute hollow pity. I told him that he had spent his entire life underestimating me. I explained that the $150,000 he stole from the local bank branch was not my life savings. It was a decoy. It was a simple, unprotected operational account I kept for minor home repairs and daily expenses. I told him I let him believe it was everything I had because I wanted him to build his own life, to find his own ambition, rather than waiting around like a vulture for me to pass away. I watched his eyes widen in confusion as the cold steel handcuffs bit into his wrists. I lowered my voice, speaking clearly, so every word would haunt him for the rest of his life. I told him about the blind trust. I told him about the 35 years of executive stock options, the performance bonuses, and the deferred equity that his mother and I had quietly compounded in the shadows of the market. I told him that while he was busy stealing pennies and selling his soul to avoid a prison sentence, my actual net worth was sitting securely in an offshore trust valued at $4.2 million. Connor stopped crying. The blood drained from his face so completely he looked like a ghost. His jaw dropped open. He realized in that exact terrifying moment that he had thrown away his career, his freedom, and his marriage for a fraction of what would have eventually been his legal inheritance. He had burned down an absolute fortune to steal pocket change. He tried to speak. He tried to apologize. He whimpered that he was my son, that he was sorry that I could use that money to pay his legal fees and save him. I looked at him and thought of his mother. I thought of the promise I made to Diane to protect him. I realized in that moment that the only way to truly honor her memory was to stop protecting him from the consequences of his own actions. I shook my head slowly. I told him that he was no longer my son. He was just a thief who got caught. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a single sheet of printed paper. It was a legally binding, irrevocable transfer of assets signed and notarized just 2 hours before we arrived at the gala. I held it up in front of his face. I told him that I had just liquidated the entire $4.2 million trust. I had signed every single cent over to a national charity dedicated exclusively to providing legal defense funds for elderly victims of family financial abuse. I told him his inheritance was gone forever. It was going to be used to hunt down predators exactly like him. I turned my back on him. I did not listen to his screaming. I did not look back as the detectives dragged him and his weeping wife out of the ballroom and into the cold night. I buttoned my suit jacket, walked out through the parting crowd of stunned executives, and left the building breathing the clean, fresh air of absolute freedom. The days that followed the gala moved with the swift, merciless efficiency of a corporate liquidation. I did not return to the hotel. I went back to my own house the very next morning. The moving truck was gone. The cardboard boxes still sat in the living room, but they were no longer monuments to my forced surrender. They were just trash waiting to be thrown out. I unpacked my late wife Diane's vintage records, first placing them carefully back on the mahogany bookshelf. The house was quieted again, but it was no longer the heavy silence of a victim waiting for the end. It was the peaceful quiet of a man who had successfully defended his fortress. The legal machinery we set in motion at the ballroom crushed my son with terrifying speed. Mr. Reynolds kept me updated on every single development. Connor was denied bail. The district attorney looked at the high-definition video confession, the forged medical documents, and the undeniable money trail leading to his employer, and decided to make an absolute example out of him. My son was formally charged with federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and felony elder abuse. His court-appointed lawyer told him he was looking at 5 to 10 years in a federal penitentiary. The young man who thought he could steal his father's life to cover up his own incompetence was now sitting in a concrete cell trading his tailored suits for a state-issued uniform. He tried to call me from the jail several times, but I instructed the telecommunications provider to permanently block the number. I had nothing left to say to him. The fallout did not stop with Connor. The corrupt physician who had so casually signed away my civil rights found himself caught in the exact same federal dragnet. Dr. Vance woke up 2 days after the gala to find investigators raiding his private practice. They confiscated his computers, his filing cabinets, and his bank records. The medical board stripped him of his license immediately pending a full criminal review. He was a man who had sold his professional soul to pay off gambling debts, and now he was going to lose everything he had ever built. He would never practice medicine again, and he was facing his own lengthy prison sentence for his role in the conspiracy. But the most complete destruction was reserved for Monica. Her entire world collapsed in a matter of hours. The morning after the gala, the board of directors held an emergency meeting at the logistics firm. They voted unanimously to terminate the chief executive officer, Mr. Carmichael, stripping him of his position, his stock options, and his golden parachute. He was publicly disgraced, his reputation reduced to ash. When Monica tried to call him for help, he completely abandoned her. He changed his phone numbers and hired an aggressive legal team to distance himself from the embezzlement scandal. He threw her away the exact same way she had tried to throw me away. With Connor locked in a federal holding facility and her wealthy lover running for the hills, Monica was left absolutely destitute. She could not access the stolen $150,000 because the authorities had completely frozen the accounts. She could not return to her apartment because she had no way to pay the rent. She was a woman who had tried to build a life on deceit, manipulation, and absolute greed, and now she had absolutely nothing to show for it. I was told she was couch surfing with distant relatives, too ashamed to show her face in our town ever again. The grand life she thought she was securing when she packed my belongings into cheap boxes had completely evaporated. I sat in my living room and drank a cup of black coffee, listening to the warm crackle of a jazz record playing on the turntable. The storm had passed. The people who tried to bury me were now buried under the weight of their own arrogance. They had mistaken my age for weakness and my silence for ignorance. They had learned the hard way that an auditor never stops working until the ledger is perfectly balanced. The late afternoon sun cast long golden shadows across the pristine lawn of my backyard. I sat in the heavy wooden rocking chair on the back porch, holding a crystal glass of rare aged bourbon. The ice clinked softly against the sides of the glass, a quiet and comforting sound that echoed through the absolute tranquility of my property. There were no moving trucks in the driveway. There were no strangers whispering in the corners of my living room. There was only the gentle rustle of the autumn leaves and the deep, unshakable peace of a man who had successfully defended his sanctuary. I took a slow sip of the bourbon, letting the warmth spread through my chest. The last few weeks had been a ruthless and necessary amputation. Removing toxic elements from your life is a painful procedure, especially when those elements share your blood. But I knew with absolute certainty that it had been a matter of survival. I had surgically excised a cancer that was actively trying to destroy my mind and my legacy. The house was mine again. My autonomy was completely secure. The $4,200,000 had been legally transferred to a charity that would use it to hunt down predators exactly like the ones I had just defeated. The financial ledger of my life was finally and perfectly balanced. I set the crystal glass down on the small patio table beside my chair. Resting next to my drink was a small stack of mail I had brought in from the mailbox earlier that afternoon. Sitting on the very top of the pile was a standard white envelope. It looked ordinary, but the return address printed in the upper left corner bore the harsh official seal of a federal correctional facility. The handwriting across the front was instantly recognizable. It was Connor. The ink was pressed deeply into the paper, the letters frantic and sloppy. I picked up the envelope and held it in my hands. I felt the slight weight of the folded paper inside. I knew exactly what words filled those pages. There would be desperate apologies. There would be tearful pleas for forgiveness and promises of profound personal change. He would beg me to hire him a defense attorney. He would beg me to dip into the fortune he now knew existed to buy him a reduced sentence. A part of my heart, the part that still remembered teaching a little boy how to throw a baseball, felt a faint tug of sorrow. It is a terrible thing to realize that the child you promised to protect has become the monster you must protect yourself from. But I was an auditor, and I knew that engaging with a fraudster only invites further manipulation. True remorse does not arrive in a panicked letter from a prison cell after a failed extortion attempt. True remorse requires taking accountability, and Connor was only apologizing because he had lost the game. My late wife Diane had made me promise to protect our son. I finally understood that the most profound way I could honor her dying wish was to let him face the brutal, unshielded reality of his own actions. I could not save him without destroying myself, and I refused to be a casualty of his greed. I stood up from the rocking chair, holding the sealed envelope. I walked through the open sliding glass door into my home office. In the corner of the room sat a heavy-duty industrial paper shredder. I walked over to the machine and flipped the power switch. It hummed to life with a low, steady vibration. I did not open the letter. I did not pause to wonder if there was a single shred of genuine love hidden among his desperate lies. Without a second thought, I dropped the unopened envelope directly into the feeding slot. The steel blades caught the paper, pulling it down and grinding his hollow apologies into hundreds of illegible, meaningless strips. I turned the machine off. The silence rushed back into the room, clean and absolute. I walked over to the corner of the office and picked up my polished golf clubs resting near the door. I slung the heavy bag over my shoulder and stepped back out into the fading sunlight. The air was crisp and clear. I walked down the driveway, heading toward the rest of my life. The storm was over. The silent adjustment was complete. The most profound lesson hidden within this ordeal is that overprotection can be a quiet poison. In a desperate attempt to shield a child from the hardships of the world, a parent can inadvertently cultivate the very greed and entitlement that might one day destroy them. True love does not mean providing an endless financial safety net or ignoring toxic behavior to maintain a facade of peace. It means having the courage to establish absolute boundaries and allowing adults to face the brutal consequences of their own actions. Sometimes the ultimate act of self-respect is walking away from the people who refuse to respect you. If you enjoyed this story of reclaiming power and setting boundaries, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your own experiences in the comments below.